Techno Rocker by Sean Lansendorfer. Min was walking to work doing her life calculations. Getting sick had put her behind, and rationing for the last few weeks hadn't been enough to offset the loss. Her stomach rumbled as she passed the food stand. Hunger had almost driven her to march over and give the synthetic attendant built into the stall her card and get a bowl of something that wasn't made of milked cockroaches. But her budget couldn't support that. She was so close to paying off the upgrade she needed to link in with the newer systems, and couldn't break now. It would be another late lunch of grape protein paste for at least another 54 days. Min didn't have time to stop anyway. That nosebleed from her last interlink had marked her as damaged goods. That meant a cut to her hours that she couldn't afford. But another incident would have her blacklisted. No more long jobs, and fewer corporations willing to have her processing data, let alone managing streams and collection. She was cutting it close as it is, and could be shipped off to a lower district at this rate. Min went through her calculations again. She had already cut sleeping down to 4, and that was pushing it. The right mix of stims would keep her upright and have her head on straight enough to work, but she couldn't afford another drop. Overclocking was standard practice. No one could function within basic parameters and keep a roof over their head. So you had to get creative and get every bit of performance out of your gear. But a bad coding job had almost fried her last time, so she would have to run a few jobs straight and hope no one noticed the dip. Her right eye still ached a bit, and the headaches flared up whenever she kept things running too long. Min groaned from the spike of pain that ran through her skull. It was her own damn fault. That week of riding high nearly burned her out for good, and is half the reason she's in this cascade now. Another round of calculations ran through her head, and even that was an indulgence. She had dawdled a bit and would have to make up the time. The alley was a risk, but the odds were only around 15% that she'd be jacked. Most of them were running old scanners after all, and her malware block wasn't cheap. She should be able to mitigate the risk. Min strolled by the burnouts, outdated implants around maggoty flesh, sunken eyes and hollowed-out faces. Those who were left behind. They kept the grubs for protein and to keep the rotting meat around their rejected parts from killing them too soon. There were a few she recognized from the plant that shut down. It was easy to tell by their specialty arms for loading and air shock knee replacements to compensate for weight. An interface to run obsolete machines still taking up space in their heads. They were an investment once, but were now thrown aside with the trash. Back on the main footpath had her passing a mate booth. People with enough credits to afford dating had their heads scanned and given a torrent of potential co-ops. She'd heard it's like your average uplink job, but you sync in with another person directly instead of having the partitions keep the cores separate. Maybe one day, but not any time soon. She didn't like the thought of it in any case, like putting yourself on the market. It was too personal, and vulnerabilities were just exploits. Min was born in one of those reproduction facilities. Most people called it the farms. Stock saved up in cooling tanks in case of a population dip. Her parents had never laid eyes on each other, and probably never knew she was even born. They used to pay good money for eggs, but that was about a decade back. There won't be a market for that again unless there's another war. Donors used to get a nice chunk of drive and enough credits to fill your average solid for getting scooped out. But that was before the restructure and mandatory company organ donation. You probably won't get half that nowadays. Biological limitations start making one wonder if it was worth it. It was expensive to get chems to balance you out. Better than risking the mood killers that came with entry-level work. Zombie mix was the tag on the street, and a hell of a lot shorter than what it was really called. It sure made the jobs easier to stomach, but stuff like that lingered in your system. Hormone imbalance from artificial solutions or the kind Mother Nature provides. Min had taken suppressants, but that didn't stop the cramps. It felt like she was getting a knife to the guts every few weeks. She was no old maid, but her line of work had an endless supply of disposable resources. Her reaction times were already starting to slow, so she hadn't the space in her mind to worry about anything else. A younger wave of processors was coming soon enough, so she needed the hours while her gray matter still worked a damn. Min was making good time. No shakedowns, no leechers, and she didn't get caught in any data raids. She may just make it to the hub in time for some preloading. It's hard to say it was the start of a good day, but certainly above average. The shattering was not immediately recognized or properly registered. A hail of safety glass gave a moment of surreal wonder, as if the first snows of winter weren't just a myth. It hadn't rained since the chemical burn that forced humanity into the domed cities. There came a forlorn sigh that faded with breathlessness, an accelerating shift of air. It was hard to tell what that sound was. It hadn't lasted long or was any louder than the other street noise, but it came right before the body landed at her feet. A frightening crunch, the wet viscera splattering about, made her instinctually recoil. The blood on her face was warm, and her overcoat was stained crimson. Another few inches and she would have broken the body's fall and joined it as meat and bone on the streets. Min shut her eyes, as if the terrible sight would disappear if she gave it a moment. This was no dream or hollow program. The sensations of a real death were not something any virtual representation did justice. You could feel it. She opened her eyes for a moment and could do no more than stare. It was a shock, but seeing a body was nothing out of the ordinary. Who hasn't done a few shifts in a refurbishment plant? An arm torn off or a lifter's hydraulics going bad often made for a grisly sight, but this was different. The twisted mess of meat and implants was fresh and divorced from expectation in a world of charted probability. This was not in her calculations. Never a consideration walking down the sterile streets of a business sector. Min remained observant despite the horrific display before her. Every detail, be it the shattered pulp of the arm or the other full-synth limb still probing the floor. The metal casing that took up a part of her skull was shattered, and the damage to her face shield was akin to a broken porcelain doll. Her chest cavity was ruptured, ribs exposed, and artificial organs spilled out onto the ground. Min could see it. The card in her temple was a Velocity X8808. One of those cost a fortune. A senile V-addict with brain rot could run a server on their own with one of those. No one was ever given long to linger on much of anything these days, and this was no exception. Bury the feeling and do what breeds advancement. The corpse stared off at the foot of the pillar. The decorative legs of the building were sprinkled red with vital lifeblood. The mechanical eyes scanned about. Her gear was making last-ditch calculations to try and save itself, though anchored to departing spirit and dying flesh. The brain's final thoughts were being processed and fed into drives. The broken shell would house the memories of a ghost. Min gave a quick glance behind her, and another to her flanks. It was an off-hour. Sessions hadn't ended yet, and the flood of drones wouldn't spill out into the streets until then. She had a waning shred of time. Security will come running out soon enough to wipe the port of any confidential info and pull out every bit of tech worth the effort. Min had to stop staring at the body. She craned her neck to see how high off the server house she fell, but couldn't see much that caught her eye before things darkened at the top of the thermal dome. You would need a serious amount of force to break through clear metal. She couldn't help but look down at the corpse again. The ocular implant had popped out of the head and was still scanning. It looked up at her. Min was scared. Her breath choked up in her throat. Was she really going to do this? Did she have the time to gamble? She got out her kit to pry open the head casing. She'd have to move fast before something with less hesitation came around. Security would lock down the sector soon, and things would devolve into a free-for-all soon enough. She had to hope there weren't any big fish caught when the walls went up. Any number of suits could get by, no questions asked. But she was a hub rat, with no protection and no paid muscle. They'd lock her up in file before she could get a word out and confiscate any bit of tech on her. May even just drop her then and there and leave her for the road sweepers to collect for protein. Min worked with what finesse was afforded her, but was cutting it close. She got the ruins of the outside cover off and was yanking away connectors. Anxiety spiked, and she had run out of suppressants the week before. There came a jolt to the body that startled Min, followed by a strained wheeze. Was the last bit of air escaping her lungs, or were her implants trying to resuscitate her corpse? The girl's pale driver arm reached out to stop Min in her tampering. There was a faint cry that ultimately fell on deaf ears. "Help me," she said. A clouded eye looked up at what would be its final sight. Min felt as though she were about to vomit, but there was nothing in her stomach, so she only retched. This was a mercy, just the way of the world. It wasn't so much wrong, but a necessity. Was there a place for humanity in these times? She was too far in to stop now, too invested. She stood and stomped in the cavity, using what subtlety her boot could spare. A rush job, but she couldn't take the risk. With a quick cord connection to ground her and her neutral bag ready, she got what high end she could and bolted for the edge of the territory. Through a few alleys and out past the market square, she could dock and lay low while they scanned the area for bolters who were too trigger-happy with what they scavenged to know any better. A few idles until the usual breaks for server maintenance, and she could get to work with only a minor cut to her hours. This would work, and it would give her a life. All she needed to do was disappear into the crowd like every other day before, and hope today wasn't the moment someone decided to notice the hungry girl they walked past 1,000 times before. Min tried not to fidget as she saw the armed men marching by in their entry gear and pup rifles. They were heading to the scene, corp security by the look of them, and the kind to thoroughly investigate. She could have wiped her card and switched it out with hers. Then they wouldn't have known anything was missing right away and deemed it a cleanup job, not a search and secure operation. That would have been smart, giving her a better chance to get away and a healthy buffer before they start looking around. Far too late now. She would just have to hope they cut their losses and moved on. Then the siren hit, and the walls came up. Min was stabbed with a near-lethal dose of anxiety. They closed 2 whole districts, maybe even a whole quadrant. That was impossible. No one has that kind of pull. She couldn't have gotten clear even if she sprinted all the way to Midpoint Hub. She could think of every sort of what-if until she was blue in the face, but that didn't stop the walls from closing off any escape. Her mind went through the calculations. All probability had her getting caught. Even if she dumped the gear and waited around to get searched, the math was clear, and math never lied. She'd cascade. Min would go down the spiral. She'd fall short on credits and never recover. No amount of time cuts or budgeting could change that. She could starve herself for half a year and still fall short of breaking even. It was over. Her gear would miss an update, and she'd be another husk sitting in an alley to die. But she had a high-end card in her pack. One of those could change everything. They used them to strategize war and divine investments. It could certainly sort out her troubles. The problem was that hardware like that was way past her limit and incompatible with her motherboard. Just trying might fry her whole system. Having it rev up past what she could process could burn a hole in her head, or break her mind completely and leave her a babbling fool. The plan was to sell it and get back on the slow and steady trail after taking the big risk. But plans change. The scanning probes were going through the streets already, setting a count of data points and thermal signals, shutting down brokers and any terminals. It was a blackout. Min had no choice. She took what precautions she could and yanked her own card. It was a long time since she was cold, leaving her systems on standby and her perception without augment. The installation was taxing, and running the card had elevated her heart rate to near bursting. It was as if she had just opened her eyes for the first time in her life and learned to fly after crawling in the mud like a worm her whole existence. Everything was clear, hyper-focused, and beautiful in detail. Min saw the operatives closing down the area. These were not your usual corporate security, mag rifles. Weapons like that are only ever lethal, even dialed to low settings. Hyper-accelerated metals seldom leave much but bloody pulp behind, and a force pulse is far from gentle. Her new implant came with a threat detector. It warned of an enemy's approach and gave her a certainty of capture if she did not move. Min stood, too abruptly to go unnoticed. A merc was moving to secure the exit but stopped to examine the sudden movement in his periphery. His rifle was set to release a force burst, not lethal in most cases, but more than enough to drop even a thug with a tank mod. "Down on your knees," he ordered. Min froze. Part of it was the amount of information coming in overwhelming her. The rest, the fear of being held at gunpoint. "I won't say it again. Drop down," he snapped, "or I'm making you a red paste stain on the wall." He struck her with the butt of his rifle not soon after making his threat. Min fell hard. Dazed and bleeding from the head, she reached up to shield her reddening face. Her cheek was already bruising. The merc stood over her and aimed his rifle at her face. "Damn jackrats, too stupid for your own good," he said with both hate and pity. The standard operating procedure was to pop one so the rest knew to keep their heads down and not try anything. It seemed this wasn't the girl's lucky day. Some chatter on the radio kept him from pulling the trigger. All the crying and yelling forced him to cover his ears so the noise didn't drown out his orders. Mercs were often drugged up with something to give them an edge, or dialing in their implants to one extreme or another. Min was overwhelmed, so deep in shock that she couldn't think. Anxiety hollowed out a hole in her gut, and tears streaked down her face. The card in her head took the initiative. Necessary memory allocation. Downloading onto hardware. Min shrieked. It was digging further into her brain. She realized then the card was expanding into gray matter, laying pathways to suit its needs. It hadn't forced her into action, but the adrenaline it pumped in, coupled with the close quarters combat manuals it downloaded, left her little choice. "Hold on, I got one of those V-junkies coming down. Repeat?" said the merc over the radio. "Understood. I'll lock this sector down." Min dropped the merc with a quick move, a kick to the back of the knee and another at the ankle. She twisted the arm back and stole the knife from his belt. It all happened so fast that Min didn't even realize he was dead, and that she was the one who jammed the blade under his helmet. The card had installed subroutines like instinct. Not a moment passed before she buried the dread and took up the rifle. Those kneeling and begging a moment ago had begun to scatter. Another merc was in the process of investigating the disturbance, but a sharp blow to the back of the head put an end to that. He never saw her coming. Min cranked up the dial of her weapon to increase the force and tighten the spread. One shot blew through the security curtain and provided her with an escape. The storefront had been evacuated, meaning there was no one to slow her advance. Through the broken shutter and up the stairs before anyone was the wiser. She'd have until the merc failed to report in. Min had made it up only 2 units before a searing pain brought her to her knees. She hit the emergency venting protocol and a jet of steam hissed out of her system. Something like that happens after a bad export or a 40-hour session. She had only been running the card for a few minutes. Her rig was a bit behind, and she knew it was a risk, but to drop her so quickly was bad news. Marching boots, it was time to go, whether she was ready or not. Min couldn't risk using the card again without a proper heatsink, and that was unlikely to happen anytime soon. It would be suicide not to install a heavy-duty interlink processor to transfer the raw data into memory. Those combat manuals nearly fried her. She kicked out a vent. They could cover more ground with their augments than she could, and the elevators would be shut down. Min crawled through a good section of ventilation before hearing pursuit. A steady tapping like a knife against metal could only mean it was a full synth they sent after her. Fluid motion and no lag. It would disable her and retrieve the card if that were its parameters. Probably rip it out of her skull. She would have to hope it didn't scan the vents and ambush it if it came down to fighting. There was no other chance. If it had a line of sight for more than a few seconds, it would be over. She hunkered down and held her breath. The sound of its pursuit halted. The silence was deafening. It had been programmed for tactics and could process a few thousand times faster than any human could. Min heard movement again, accelerating to a sudden crash. She tried to discern what it was doing. A laser burst through the steel and sliced the vent ahead of her. The second beam would have taken her legs if she hadn't moved. The entire section crashed in a heap among the shelves of a store. Min stifled her screams of pain and discomfort. Not that it did her any good. The synth pierced the vent and pulled it back like it was a sardine can. She brought up her rifle and took a shot and then another. The synth dodged, pulling back to avoid the deadly force of energy. It came back with a sudden attack, thrusting its arm into where she lay. It leaned in to confirm the kill right after, only to find her gone. She had turned off the inertial dampener on her rifle and used the second shot to send her flying out of the end of the vent and into the far wall. She recovered and switched to a wide pulse after turning on the dampener again to blow a hole through to the offices next door. She had been on her feet and in its sight line for about a second and heard the sound of its gun charging. It took 2 shots, but it had guessed she was a bit taller than she actually was. A lucky break that let her escape into the maze of cubicles. Min was low, moving down the line of desks in a roadie run. She heard the synth enter and start scanning. It heard her footfalls and fired in a pattern along the route it had calculated for her. She stopped as the shot ripped through the dividing walls and into the floor, and had to dive out of the way of the next spread and hope it hadn't pinpointed her exact landing. The synth shot 2 gas grenades in. Min didn't know if it was a nerve agent or just something to get her coughing, but she didn't stop to find out. She put down her goggles and fastened her mask. You need new filters every week in the city unless you have a respirator. Min just had to hope her gear would give her a few moments. The steady hiss of the grenades died as the stabbing steps of the synth could be heard approaching her last known position. She jacked into the nearby office port to see what she could get to cover her escape. She got everything that beeped and booped and flashed and lit up to go off, and Army crawled to the door. She overheated some systems to blur its thermal reading. Another series of shots rang out as she moved, silencing more and more of the digital din. Min made it to the door and slammed it. The synth was there in one leap, ripping through the barrier and scanning for her. She was ready and waiting with her back against the cubicle, having never left the room. Taking aim was easy when you were point blank. The pulse ripped through the steel frame and launched the thing across the room. Min got to her feet and went to make sure it was dead. The synth had been mangled from the force, its crumpled form lodged into the far wall. She adjusted the firing pattern into a focused beam and warily took aim. She sent another shot, drilling through its chest. The synth's canine-like rear legs had been left inoperable, and it had a gaping hole in its torso. It came crashing down very suddenly, startling the poor girl. She fumbled with her rifle despite all the combat drilling the card had seared into her gray matter. Min was anything but shy now. She aimed her rifle to ensure that it stayed down, in no way fool enough to close the distance, but she was still unprepared for how quickly it could move. The synth used its flexible forelimbs to avoid the first panicked burst and scurried out of her line of sight. She lost it in the ruin of shelves and debris. It had lost its primary power cell, but must have had redundancies. The sudden silence allowed her to hear the mercs coming in from the left. It took them a while to make it down the way, but not to fire on her position. Min had the good sense to kneel as she turned in time to save her head and make a splatter out of the first man who stepped out. The second came out spraying, forcing her to drop to cover. She crawled away, making sure to stay moving and ensure they didn't know her exact position. The burst of gunfire ceased, and the sounds of heavy boots rushing in became audible once the ringing in her ears stopped. They had surrounded her previous position. The sound of thermal visors activating was a troubling development. She was out in the open, and the store shelves were not likely to offer much coverage. Her rising body heat was one thing, but the hissing cooling vent from an overtaxed sink would give her away in an instant. The longer she kept it bottled up, the more damage it would do. She looked at the ammo count in her rifle. Less than she'd hoped, and far from what it would take to shoot her way out. The weapon was a portable matter accelerator. It would have to serve her in a way apart from its usual idiom. The merc scanned the area, converging on an overloading matter rifle in time for it to burst. Min scrambled through the vents, making a quick hackbot to open it up and stop any fans that could have blocked her way. Her distraction left her without a primary weapon, but she was making good ground and already depositing herself into a maintenance area that would give her free rein to access any level she chose. She more fell down a section of ventilation than gracefully arrived at her destination. She entered the service elevator, rerouting power to bring it to life despite the lockdown. The maneuver may alert them, but her calculations made it clear that she'd be away before they could act on it. From a higher floor, she could jump to the next building and clear over the traffic walls and roving mercs. Whatever big movers or corpos had paid to lock down the sector would be left empty-handed. The elevator came to a gentle stop and its doors opened. Min picked up a power saw from the tool chest to cut her way through a window. She turned to the sound of the main elevator door opening and dropped to cover but saw nothing exit the lift. She didn't do that. The mercs would be on their way, but not so soon. Min didn't have time to waste. She gave the closing doors one final look before preparing to move. It was a sudden cacophony of scraping and mechanical screeching like a failing engine. The synth had followed her here and had been biding its time to strike. It had found a way to balance its weight on the limbs that remained but forewent that adaptation for speed when the time came to strike. The synth dragged itself in a frightful lurch, pouncing onto its target. One limb gripped her arm, sealing its grasp with a painful snap. Her bones smashed into powder. It reasserted its hold to keep her down so as to rip out the merchandise it was tasked with retrieving. Min had no choice but to act or die. She booted up the system before it had fully cooled. It was her only chance. Calculations were made, and schematics were downloaded. She felt the implant searing her flesh and system interface akin to the power saw that was taking the offending limb and sinking into the main chassis of her enemy. The implant had foregone the easier target, which was its backup power supply, in favor of cutting out an opening to its direct inputs. Min plugged into the synth and reprogrammed it faster than any human could possibly work. Its grip was released, and its command parameters were changed. She was ready to give the first set of orders, but was left in agony. The implant had overloaded her system. The high temperature of its operation had fused it into her hardware. The cooling process had failed, and emergency venting was in progress. The implant moved to save itself. Min's eye burst from the heat as her one good arm was co-opted. She watched on as a spectator as her hand dug into the synth, taking what was needed to augment her systems. The cannibalization of hardware was efficient and brutal. Min could only watch in horror as her damaged arm was severed and replaced. The optical node of the synth was fitted into her empty socket. The implant had done what it needed in order to survive, but the process was deeply traumatizing for the poor girl who still housed the chip. Min remained locked away, for they were still in danger. The implant was in control now and ready to act. The mercs had zeroed in on her position. She felt the jolt of electric blood and wiring bring her new eye to life. Its readings were feeding data past her processors and right to the implant. The enemies were coming in with a standard breach procedure. Min's body went into action. It was a blur of violence, too much to bear. Sensory overload drove her mind to hide away in her subconscious to remove itself from the slaughter. She returned from fleeting thought and understanding once they were already far from the lockdown zone, well on her way to the slums. It was easier to hide amongst the burnouts, and one was less likely to be caught on surveillance in the sewers and back alleys where no one cared to look. Her body's control was returned to her once outside the main streets of the city. Min lamented the death of her old identity and the burden of action she was forced to commit. Her hope had come at a heavy cost and did more to leave her inhuman and broken. They had logged her face, or at least what was left of it. She didn't want to think what she looked like now, or felt she could stomach what sort of damage was done. Staring down at her new limb, once with her human eye, and then again with her new ocular sensor. It had smashed a man's skull in, and pierced another through the heart. She had never killed anyone before today, but blew a merc's head off before the implant took control. That was her choice, her action. The blood was on her hand. She would have to live with it. Min brought up her hood and curled up in the fetal position. Her new photographic memory had captured every moment. She could play it back over and over with perfect detail. A glimpse of her visage in the nearby puddle took her out of her ruminating thoughts for a moment. She took a piece of fabric from her torn sleeve to bandage over the mess of machinery that was one side of her face. An alert flashed during her breakdown. She needed biomatter to sustain her functions. The implant had already dampened her immune system in order to modify her body without risk of rejection. What was further tweaks to her metabolism? The red optic glowed under her concealment. It was scanning for fuel and locked onto a rat. Min would have rather gone hungry or risked the trip to the nearest food paste dispensary. The implant fed her brain endorphins and put up a flash of data in her ocular feed. It was manipulating her with not only a stream of information, but the metaphorical carrot on a stick. She caught the rat, and the plasma torch in her new arm charred away the risk of disease. She took a bite, and her taste buds were ignored. The signal's scent made it seem she was eating filet mignon. She never had it, but it wasn't to her taste. Even with her brain rewired to love the flavor, it was just blood and iron to her. There she was with the most advanced personal rig in the city, eating rats with the burnouts in the alley. Min would need to work, and was confident she had impressive enough hardware to convince most dealers to turn a blind eye to the procurement method of her tech. Another city, and another life. One not lived with an ever-present calculus. She would have enough credits to eat more than protein paste, sleep more than a few hours, cover the service fees and operating costs, and live a life that was not just entropy painted as survival. Min felt hope for the first time. She would need to mend, but could scrape by for a few weeks. What was a little more hardship compared to the existence she knew prior? Min could not suppress old habits, a compulsion to go through the math of the day to see where she stood. It was the first bright spot since finding the implant. Despite having nothing and losing everything she knew before today, this was the best chance for a future that she ever had. Curious how she neglected to recall the details. Soon, she would have the credits to never bother with worrying and build influence so she can have others do the grunt work for the illusion of enough. She shored up the covering over her eye and arm and made sure the fused mess of her port and input hub were concealed. She never considered she would go full synth, but there were many small concessions to get this far. It was hard to remember if she had any dreams or not. Her parents tried to keep her whole, but that ended up costing her more later. Having to learn what it was she was sacrificing made the loss feel quaint. She tried to keep herself pure, just to have it cut away or mangled. Finding out human wasn't enough to survive this world was a cruel lesson. Min sobbed. It was a striking realization. Those weren't her memories. She got a ticket for the mag train with the last of her credits. Going from an unknown dime-a-dozen data junkie to a mainframe host or a projection analyst wasn't just a pipe dream now. The sky wasn't even a barrier. They needed pilots to navigate the debris field between here and Luna. It was a strange sensation, thinking of tomorrow with hope, seeing possibilities. It was a few weeks of laying low and odd jobs before she went looking for real work. Men got the pick of the litter. Word getting out wasn't a worry if she was worth the investment. She'd be guarded like a golden goose. It was a good gig she landed, her own office on the upper floors and everything. It was all perfect until it wasn't. Min heard the shots shatter her dream of paradise. Her personal Shangri-La had vanished as soon as it came. She didn't need the ballistic database to know it was the kind of equipment only high-end mercs used. She looked down to see them storming the building. Who sold her out? Who was willing to risk war with a full-fledged guild? Did it matter? They were coming for her, taking the building in broad daylight in the middle of the most populated sector. These mercs were working for someone too powerful to have the same restrictions as even the top brokers. When she thought she had finally crawled out of the muck to evolve legs, what she thought was the ocean turned out to be nothing but a puddle. There was always something bigger to swallow up her world. Min ran. She got to the top of the building in time to realize she was trapped. She stood on the edge and looked down at the dense city streets below. They were all ants, a disposable resource to feed the terrible beast they created, sacrificing humanity to glut its own corruption. All this pomp and luxury to drown in. It was toil with another name. The same old trappings dressed as progress. There was always someone getting the larger portion, and it was never going to be her. What was sacred could be sold, and now there was nothing left and nowhere to climb out of. Maybe she could have made a break for it, but why bother? Min ran through the old line of calculation that had once dictated her life. She didn't know what spurred the thought, but it was almost comforting to drift back to what felt like simpler times. The young woman gave a sad smile. She never had a chance. She wasn't going to make enough to ever get out of that hole, no matter what she did. It was clear now. She had been brave, quietly raged against the inevitable. There was honor in that struggle, but no one could endure forever. Was it nobler to keep yourself in the end, or surrender everything piecemeal for a chance? It was too late for her to know now. She had no soul left to save. As she hurled toward the cold embrace of the city streets below, Min reveled in her short time in the sun. It was more than most got. She got to pretend for a bit, and the implant fed her a fantasy sweet enough to die to. Her perceptions slowed as chemicals flooded her brain and played out a dream to dream. There was grass there and real sunshine. People could smile, and love was effortless. The fruit burst with flavor, and the water was clean. It sang as it rolled over the stones. Trellis was going through his budget and time management. Taking cover after those gunshots put him behind schedule. He would have to rush from the shelter to his first coding job. There was a wet thud, along with the sound of metal hitting concrete. He stopped to look at the body before him. It was a young woman, left a mangled, bloody mess. She had a smile and tears mixed in with the streaks of blood on her face. Trellis was shocked. It was as if the breath was knocked out of him. He didn't know how to react until something caught his eye. A person can't stew on emotions long in this day and age, and implants like that could change everything. He would just have to be quick, and it would all work out. This wasn't a tragedy, but an opportunity.